The air in the lawyer's office was not merely cool. It was refrigerated, a deliberately manufactured chill designed to preserve the solemnity of the dead. It smelled of lemon-scented polish and the faint, acrid tang of old paper, the scent of concluded deals and sealed fates. The room was a stage set for finality, all dark, gleaming mahogany and walls lined with thick, leather-bound volumes containing the silent, dusty laws of man. Light filtered through the slats of the blinds, cutting the carpet into sterile, parallel lines, like bars on a cage. I sat in the middle of the three client chairs, a plush, uncomfortable leather that sighed and creaked with every slight shift in posture. My brothers were my bookends. Michael, the eldest on my right, was a sculpture of contained potential energy. I could feel the heat radiating from him, see the subtle, rhythmic clenching of his jaw muscle beneath the recently shaven skin. He was dressed for a board meeting he was about to inherit. His suit a shade of charcoal, so severe it seemed to absorb the light. To my left, David, the youngest, fidgeted. His excitement was a live wire, manifesting in the nervous tap of his Italian loafer against the leg of his chair and the way his fingers traced the intricate pattern on his platinum cufflinks. He was already mentally spending it, I could tell. A new yacht, a place in the Bahamas final, gilded upgrade to his life of curated leisure. I was the void between them, the neutral space. I wore a simple, black dress I'd pulled from the back of my closet, something plain and unassuming, suitable for the funeral 2 days prior and now, apparently, for my own financial execution. My hands were folded in my lap, pale and still against the dark fabric. I felt numb, insulated by a fog of grief that had not yet lifted, a fog my father's death had only thickened. Mr. Thorne, the family lawyer, was a man who had perfected the art of emotionless delivery. His voice was a dry, precise instrument, a scalpel for dissecting a life into legal clauses and subparagraphs. He cleared his throat, the sound like gravel shifting in a tin cup, and began. The preamble was a drone of being of sound mind and last testament, words that felt like a lie. The man who had dictated this document had been of a singular mind, yes, but sound was debatable. To my eldest son, Michael James Thorne, Thorne began, and Michael's posture straightened another imperceptible degree. I bequeath my entire majority shareholding, comprising 58% in Thorne Dynamics Incorporated, along with the title and responsibilities of Chief Executive Officer. It was a kingdom, a multi-million-dollar empire built on aerospace components and ruthless negotiation. Michael gave a single, sharp nod, a general accepting his command. There was no surprise, only the grim satisfaction of a prophecy fulfilled. Thorne's eyes moved to David. To my youngest son, David Charles Thorne, I bequeath the entirety of my real estate portfolio, including the commercial properties held under Thorne Realty Ventures, the residential estate in Aspen, and the liquid assets held in the Bainbridge and Lexington investment trusts. A fortune in bricks, mortar, and stocks. David's breath escaped in a soft, shuddering sigh of pure relief. A smile, quick and triumphant, touched his lips before he suppressed it, remembering the setting. He glanced sideways at me, not to share the moment, but to see if I was witnessing his triumph. His eyes held a flicker of pity, quickly extinguished by his own glee. Then there was me. The air in the room seemed to still further, the hum of the air conditioner fading into a profound silence. Mr. Thorne adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the document before him as if double-checking a bizarre anomaly. He cleared his throat again, this time with a hint of discomfort that was more terrifying than his prior clinical calm. "And to my daughter," he said, and the word daughter felt like a label, not a term of endearment, Elise Marie Thorne. He paused. A lifetime of being the afterthought, the quiet one, the disappointment crystallized in that pause. My heart, a sluggish, heavy thing in my chest, gave a single, hard thump. "I leave the sum of $1. The words landed not with a shout, but with the quiet, final click of a lock. $1. The ultimate insult, a sum so trivial it was meant not to provide, but to invalidate. It was a slap in the face, administered from the grave. The numbness that had protected me began to crack, and a cold, sharp shame started to seep through. Mr. Thorne still wasn't looking at me. He was reading the next line, the justification, the epitaph my father had chosen for me. His voice, for the first time, held a faint, reluctant tremor. For a child with no ambition, a mere token is sufficient. I stopped breathing. The world narrowed to the lawyer's thin, bloodless lips. She has proven herself worthless. Worthless. The word did not echo. It did not ring through the room. Instead, it fell into the space between us like a stone into a deep, dark well, sinking slowly, its implications spreading out in ever-widening ripples. It was a verdict, a final, venomous judgment that stripped me of my identity and left a hollow shell labeled worthless. He had not just disinherited me, he had defined me. He had taken the sum total of my life, my choices, my passions, my quiet existence, and assessed its value at less than the price of a cup of coffee. I dared to look at my brothers. Michael was studying the pattern in the Persian rug, his jaw so tight I thought it might snap. He was embarrassed, not for me, but by the public spectacle of my denouncement. David had the decency to look stunned, his mouth slightly agape, but his eyes, when they flicked to me, held no protest, no outrage on my behalf. They held a confirmation. They had always known, hadn't they, that I was the lesser one, the one who didn't get it, the one who chose canvases and charcoal over spreadsheets and stock reports. The polished wood of the desk, the sterile air, the weight of my brother's silent acquiescence, it all pressed in on me. The single dollar, had it been physically present, would have burned a hole through my palm. But it was the word that truly seared itself into my soul. It was my inheritance. Not money, not property, but a single, devastating word from a dead man that would follow me for the rest of my life. Worthless. And in that cold, silent room, surrounded by the spoils of my brother's victory, I had never felt the truth of it more. It wasn't just a word. It was a key, cold and sharp, that turned a lock deep inside me, swinging open a door I'd spent a lifetime trying to keep closed. Behind that door was not a single memory, but a tidal wave of them, a curated collection of every slight, every dismissive glance, every unspoken criticism that now, with that one final, public pronouncement, coalesced into a brutal, coherent narrative. My life, reframed. My father had not merely disinherited me. He had authored my biography in a single, devastating sentence. The first few days after the reading of the will were a blur of muted colors and muffled sounds. I moved through my small apartment like a ghost haunting its own life. I would pick up a coffee mug and set it down without drinking. I would stand before the canvas in my studio, a half-finished cityscape drenched in the soft gold of a setting sun, and my hand would refuse to lift the brush. The vibrant pigments on my palette seemed to mock me, their boldness a stark contrast to the gray filter that had descended over my world. No ambition, he'd said. What was ambition to him? It was a quantifiable thing, a graph, trending upward, a bank statement, growing fat. It was not this quiet, stubborn pursuit of beauty, this attempt to capture a fleeting feeling in a stroke of color. To him, my passion was a hobby, a distraction, a proof of my triviality. The memories played behind my eyes on a relentless loop, each one sharpened by the newfound context of his final judgment. I was 17, my hands trembling as I showed him my portfolio for art school. He hadn't even opened it. He had simply looked at the binder, then at me, his expression one of profound disappointment. Elise, he'd sighed, the sound heavy with exasperation. This is not a path. This is a detour, a dead end. Your brothers are building futures. You're doodling. He had used that word, doodling. It had shrunk my soul, made my passion feel childish and insignificant. I saw the family dinners, the way he would lean forward, his eyes alight, as Michael discussed a corporate acquisition or David explained a new, high-yield investment strategy. The conversation was a lively current, and I was a rock on the bank, separate, unmoving. When the talk would inevitably turn to me, his smile would not disappear, but it would change. It would become polite, patient, a mask stretched thin over a bedrock of bafflement. "And how are your paintings?" he would ask, the slight pause before the word a tiny, precise dagger. My quiet nature, my introspection, which I had always considered a core part of my identity, was, in his eyes, a flaw. A lack of the aggressive drive he so admired in my brothers. The most painful memories were the subtlest. The way his smile, genuine and broad when greeting one of my brothers, would subtly fade, just a fraction, when his eyes landed on me entering a room. It was as if my presence introduced a note of dissonance into the symphony of his ideal family. I was the quiet, artistic daughter, a puzzle piece from the wrong box, forever failing to fit into the grand, gilded picture he was building. For weeks, I was a spectator in my own life. The city outside my window, once a source of endless inspiration, became a flat, two-dimensional postcard. The sounds of traffic were a distant hum, the laughter from a neighboring balcony a foreign language. I was insulated, wrapped in a thick layer of cotton wool, with that one word, worthless, beating at the center of it all like a diseased heart. People called, my brothers, their voices laced with a clumsy, guilty concern. "It's just money, Elise," David had said, and the hypocrisy was so staggering it was almost funny. Michael offered practical advice. "You can contest it. We'll back you." But it wasn't about the legal battle. It was about the psychological one. How do you contest a father's opinion of your soul? The $36 million wasn't the wound. The money was an abstraction, a number with too many zeros to truly comprehend. I had never wanted his empire. I had never coveted the cold weight of his fortune. The wound was the salt he had deliberately, meticulously ground into it. The salt of his rejection. The salt of his public assessment of my value. It was the realization that the one person whose approval I had, in some secret, childlike corner of my heart, always craved, had looked at the sum total of my being and found it not just lacking, but worthless. I would catch my reflection in a shop window and not recognize the woman staring back. Her shoulders were slumped, her eyes hollow. Is that what I am? I would think. Is that the truth he saw that I was blind to? The word became a parasite, feeding on my confidence, my identity, my very sense of reality. He had branded me, and the scar tissue was forming, hard and ugly, over the person I used to be. The world was muted, yes, but the echo of that single word was deafening, a constant, brutal drumbeat in the silence. The task of clearing out my childhood home was a sentence, a penance I had to serve in the aftermath of the verdict. My brothers, now lords of their new domains, had delegated the duty with a wave of their hands and the hollow offer to hire a crew. I refused. This was my burden to bear, the final, messy interaction with the physical evidence of a life that had ultimately rejected me. The house, a sprawling colonial that had always felt more like a museum than a home, was now a tomb filled with the artifacts of a ghost. His ghost. For days, I moved through the hollow, echoing rooms like an archaeologist of my own grief. Each object was a relic. The leather chair in his study, worn smooth in the shape of his body, still seemed to hold his imposing presence. The silver trophy on the mantel, awarded to him as businessman of the decade, gleamed dully, a monument to the ambition I had failed to inherit. I packed his life into cardboard boxes, my movements mechanical, my heart a numb, heavy weight in my chest. The silence of the house was a presence in itself, broken only by the rustle of packing paper and the occasional, startling creak of the floorboards. It was on the final day that I found myself in the attic. The air up there was different, thicker, older, untouched by the central air conditioning that had preserved the rest of the house. It was hot and still, heavy with the scent of dried-out wood, ancient insulation, and the faint, sweet smell of decaying paper. Dust motes danced in the single, slanting beam of sunlight that cut through the grime-caked circular window, illuminating a landscape of forgotten things. This was not my father's domain. This was the house's subconscious, a place where memories were stored but not curated. There were steamer trunks filled with my brother's old sports equipment, a dressmaker's dummy draped in a yellowed sheet, stacks of National Geographic magazines from a bygone era. I worked methodically, my movements stirring up clouds of dust that made me cough. I was marking boxes for donation, for trash, for nothing. It felt like the final erasure. My old bedroom was directly below. I remembered lying in that bed as a child, staring at the ceiling, tracing the patterns in the stucco, my mind a whirl of dreams and colors far removed from the world downstairs. I felt safe up here, tucked away. Now, standing near the spot where my headboard would have been, my foot encountered a slight unevenness in the floor. A warp board. I knelt, my knees pressing into the gritty floor. I ran my fingers along the seam. It was loose. With a fingernail, I pried it up. The wood groaned in protest, releasing a puff of ancient dust. Beneath it, in a shallow hollow between the joists, lay a small, rectangular object. It was a box about the size of a thick book, made of lacquered wood with a delicate, inlaid pattern of mother-of-pearl flowers, forget-me-nots. I had never seen it before. I lifted it out. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, solid. The lacquer was clouded with age, but the inlay still caught the dim light, shimmering faintly. This was not my father's. His taste ran to solid oak and polished brass. This was something else, something delicate, hidden, something cherished. A current, something more than curiosity, pricked at the back of my neck. I carried the box over to the beam of light, sitting cross-legged on the dusty floor. The clasp was a simple, tarnished silver hook. I took a deep, shaky breath, the dusty air catching in my throat, and opened it. The interior was lined with faded blue velvet, worn thin in places. And there, resting in a perfect hollow carved into the fabric, was a single envelope. Next to it, a small, square photograph, its colors softened by time. I picked up the photograph first. It was my mother. She was young, younger than I ever remembered her, sitting on a stone wall somewhere, her head thrown back in laughter. The sun was on her face, and her eyes, so often in my memory shadowed by a quiet sadness, were alight with a joy that was almost palpable. She looked free. Then my fingers, now trembling, found the envelope. It was of a fine, creamy paper, gone brittle with the years. And on its face, in a script I knew as well as my own, was my name. Elise. It was her handwriting, my mother's. That elegant, flowing script, each letter a work of art, so different from my father's sharp, aggressive strokes. Just the sight of it was a physical blow, a direct line to a love I had missed every day for 20 years. I brought the envelope to my face, closing my eyes. And there it was, faint, almost gone, a ghost of a scent clinging to the paper. Not the expensive, cold perfume she wore for my father's parties, but the simple, light floral fragrance, jasmine and something like vanilla. That was hers alone. The scent of her skin when she'd hug me goodnight. The scent of her handkerchief. A scent I had forgotten until this very moment. A scent that unlocked a vault of memory, so potent it brought hot, sudden tears to my eyes. The attic, the dust, the weight of my father's judgment, it all fell away. In that silent, sun-drenched space, it was just me and this artifact, this message from the past. The paper was thin, 20 years old. She had written this as she was dying, knowing she would not see me grow up. She had hidden it here, beneath the floorboards by my bed, a secret for me to find when the time was right, or when I needed it most. The numbness that had encased me for weeks began to crack. This was not my father's legacy. This was hers. I held my breath, the world reduced to the feel of the brittle paper in my hands, the ghost of jasmine in the air, and the profound, terrifying silence before the first word. The world ceased to exist. The dust-choked attic, the weight of the empty house below, the echoing verdict of the will, it all dissolved into a formless blur. There was only the brittle paper in my hands, the faint, sacred scent of jasmine, and the thunderous beating of my own heart. My fingers, clumsy and shaking, threatened to tear the fragile edges as I carefully, so carefully, unfolded the single sheet. The paper crackled, a tiny sound that seemed to split the silence of 2 decades. And then I began to read. My dearest girl, the voice was not a memory. It was not a recollection of a sound from long ago. It was her. It was as if she had just whispered the words directly into my ear, her tone warm, intimate, and laced with a profound, aching love. The sound of it, so clear and immediate in my mind, stole the breath from my lungs. I had to stop, close my eyes, and press the heel of my hand to my sternum, as if to keep my heart from breaking out of my chest. If you're reading this, then I am gone, and you're no longer the little girl who used to bring me dandelions as if they were the most precious roses in the world. I have missed watching you grow. I have missed 1,000 moments, your first day of high school, your first heartbreak, the woman you are becoming. This is the cruelest cut of this illness, the knowledge of all the life I will not share with you. I have so much to say to you, my Elise, and so little time and paper. I must speak of things I've kept silent, truths I have held close to my heart to protect you. I must start with the man you call father. A cold dread, entirely different from the numb ache of my father's rejection, trickled down my spine. This was it, the turning of a key. Robert is a man ruled by fear. He will present himself to the world, and to you and your brothers, as a man of immense strength and ambition. But it is all a fortress, my love, a fortress he has built to protect a heart that is terrified of being seen as weak, as insignificant. He believes the world is a battlefield that must be conquered with money and power, and he measures every human soul by that single, brutal metric. He cannot help it. It is the only language he understands. I saw it then, with a clarity that was almost violent. The relentless drive, the cold assessments, the disdain for anything that couldn't be quantified. It wasn't just personality, it was pathology, a prison he had built for himself. He will try to mold you and your brothers in his image. Michael will likely succeed. He already has that same hard fire in his belly. David will learn to play the game, to smile and barter for a share. But you, my love, you are different. From the moment you were born, with your quiet, watchful eyes, I knew you were not of his world. Your gentle soul, your capacity to see beauty where others see balanced sheets, that is your strength. And it terrifies him because he cannot understand it. He will call it a weakness. He may even call you. I knew the word was coming. I could feel it hovering on the page, a specter she was about to name. Worthless. A sob, dry and ragged, escaped my throat. She had known. 20 years ago, from her deathbed, she had foreseen this exact moment, this precise wound. She had seen the weapon he would one day use, and had left me a shield. If he has said this to you, I need you to hear me now, my darling girl, as clearly as if I were standing before you. You are not. Your worth was never, ever meant to be measured in his currency. It cannot be. You are the child of a different creation entirely. Your value is in your compassion, in the way you study a fallen leaf, as if it holds the secrets of a universe, in the beauty you will create with your hands and your heart. Do not let his fear become your truth. The tears were flowing freely now, hot and silent, splashing onto the worn velvet of the box in my lap. They were not tears of the pain I had been carrying for weeks. They were tears of release, of a dam breaking under the pressure of a long-awaited validation. It was as if a hand, warm and gentle, had reached through time and laid itself upon my wounded soul. But she was not finished. The letter took a breath, the script becoming, if possible, even more deliberate. Which brings me to the most important truth, the one I have guarded with my life. Robert is not your biological father. The words did not register at first. They sat on the page, stark and impossible. I read them again and again. The air left the attic. The beam of sunlight seemed to freeze. Not your biological father. The foundation of my identity, already cracked, now shattered completely. The man whose name I carried, whose judgment had defined me, whose blood I thought ran in my veins, was not my father. His name was Julian Vance. He was an artist, a painter. He saw the world in colors and light, just as you do. We loved each other with a fierceness and a joy that I have never known before or since. He died just a few months after you were born in a car accident. The world lost a brilliant light, and you, my darling, lost a father who would have cherished every beautiful, unique part of you. Julian Vance. I repeated the name in my mind. It felt foreign, yet it resonated in a place deep within me, a chord I had never heard but somehow recognized. Robert never knew. He and I were separated at the time. When I returned, pregnant with you, he accepted you as his own. Out of pride, perhaps, or a sense of possession. But he has always seen Julian in you, Elise. He has seen his ghost in your eyes, in your temperament, in your talents. And he has hated it. He could not conquer Julian in life, and he could not mold you into his image in death. Your very existence is a reminder of a man he could never be, and of a part of my heart he could never own. The puzzle pieces of my life, the jagged, painful fragments, suddenly flipped over, revealing a completely different picture. Every slight, every coldness, every moment of baffled disdain, it wasn't about me. It was about a ghost, a rivalry from beyond the grave. I was not worthless. I was a living monument to a man my father had envied and despised. The letter was ending. Her script became a little shakier, as if the effort of writing had been immense. I have left you something, my love, something that is yours by right. Julian left everything to me, his entire collection of paintings, his copyrights, his legacy. Robert knows nothing of it. I have placed it all in a trust for you, to be received when you turn 25. The details are with a lawyer, a good man named Arthur Finch. Find him. Be brave, my dearest girl. The world will try to tell you who you are, but only you can decide that. Remember the dandelions. Remember me. Remember that you are, and always have been, loved beyond measure. With all my heart. Mother. I sat there for a long time, the letter held gently in my hands, the scent of jasmine a tender embrace. The silence of the attic was no longer oppressive. It was sacred. The gray filter through which I had seen the world was gone, washed away by a cleansing flood of tears and truth. The word worthless lay in the dust at my feet, its power extinguished. It had never been my truth. It had been his fear. I was not Robert Thorne's daughter. I was Elise, the daughter of a woman of profound courage and foresight, and of a man named Julian, an artist. And for the first time in my life, that felt like everything. The world had not simply changed. It had been unmade and rewoven into a new, almost incomprehensible tapestry. I sat on the dusty attic floor for what felt like an eternity, the letter a fragile anchor in the whirlpool of my upended reality. The words echoed, each one a seismic shock that rearranged the very bedrock of my identity. Robert is not your biological father. His name was Julian, Julian Vance. I read the paragraph again, the one that had made my heart stop and then restart with a new, frantic rhythm. Your gentle soul, your capacity to see beauty where others see balanced sheets. That is your strength. And it terrifies him because he cannot understand it. It was the perfect, devastating diagnosis. All my life, I had thought my father's disappointment was a response to my failure. I had internalized it, believing I was not enough, not driven enough, not ambitious enough, not enough like him. But now I saw the truth. It wasn't a failure to meet a standard. It was a fundamental incompatibility of spirit. My very nature, the core of who I was an affront to him because it was a living, breathing relic of the man he had betrayed. I wasn't failing a test. I was the wrong species being judged in the wrong kingdom. The letter explained it all with a clarity that was both brutal and liberating. In their early 20s, Robert and Julian had been partners, not just in business, but in vision. Julian was the creative force, the dreamer with a revolutionary idea for a new polymer coating. Robert was the hustler, the negotiator, the one who knew how to talk to banks and investors. They were two halves of a whole, the artist and the businessman. And for a time, it worked. But Robert's ambition was a voracious thing, fed by a deep-seated insecurity that festered every time Julian received praise for his genius. The business deal that formed the foundation of the Thorne fortune, the one he'd always recounted as a tale of his own shrewdness and daring, was, in truth, his betrayal. He had secretly negotiated a side deal, cut Julian out of the patents and the lion's share of the profits, and used the capital to launch Thorne Dynamics alone. He didn't just steal an idea. he stole a future. He presented it to the world, and to my mother, as a necessary business decision, the cutting away of dead weight to ensure success. My mother knew the truth, and in the wake of the betrayal, she had drawn closer to Julian, the wounded party, the brilliant light his former friend had tried to extinguish. Their connection, born of shared hurt and a deep, mutual understanding, had blossomed into the love she described, a love with a fierceness and a joy she had never known with Robert. I was the product of that love. And then Julian was gone, killed in an accident that felt, as my mother wrote, like the universe itself had suffered a great injustice. She was left alone, pregnant, and facing a desolate future. Robert, perhaps out of a twisted sense of guilt, perhaps out of a lingering possessiveness for my mother, perhaps simply to maintain his own carefully constructed image, had taken her back. He had agreed to raise me as his own, on the condition that Julian's name was never mentioned again. Julian Vance was to be erased. But my mother was not a woman to be entirely defeated. She had one thing left of Julian, one thing Robert knew nothing about. Before his death, Julian, perhaps sensing the fragility of life, had formally signed over his entire artistic legacy to her. Not the patents or the business schemes, but his soul, his collection of paintings, his sketches, his notebooks, and most importantly, the copyright to all of it. It was a treasure trove of creativity that had no value in Robert's world of balance sheets, and so he had never thought to look for it. My mother, with the quiet cunning of a protector, had hidden it away in a trust, a time capsule of my true heritage waiting for the day I would need it most. The magnitude of it all pressed down on me, not as a weight, but as a revelation. The man who had called me worthless had built his entire empire on the ruin of the man whose blood I shared. The source of my worthlessness, in his eyes, was, in fact, my true inheritance. The gentle soul, the artist's eye, the quiet nature, these were not flaws. They were a legacy. I thought of the half-finished canvas in my studio, the one I hadn't been able to touch for weeks. I thought of the way I saw light and shadow, the compulsion to mix colors until they captured a specific, fleeting emotion. I had always felt it was something that set me apart, made me alien in my own family. Now I knew it was a thread connecting me to a father I had never met. It was in my blood. It was my birthright. The $36 million, the stocks, the real estate. It all seemed so hollow, so transient. It was money built on a lie, on a betrayal. My inheritance was not a number in a bank account. It was a legacy of creation. It was the copyright to a vision of the world, a collection of someone's heart and soul rendered in pigment and oil. What was the value of that? It was a value Robert Thorne could never calculate because it existed in a dimension beyond his comprehension. A strange, powerful sense of calm settled over me. The gnawing ache of inadequacy that had been my constant companion since the reading of the will was gone. In its place was a solid, unshakable core of identity. I was not the failed daughter of Robert Thorne. I was Elise Vance, the daughter of Julian Vance, the artist, and of Eleanor, the woman who had loved him enough to protect his legacy for 2 decades. I carefully, reverently, folded the letter and placed it back in a lacquered box. The scent of jasmine seemed to have infused itself into my skin, a permanent reminder. I knew what I had to do. I had to find Arthur Finch. I had to claim what was mine. Not for the money, not for revenge, but for the truth. It was time to step out of the shadow of a man who was not my father and into the light of the one who was. The world outside the attic felt different. The colors of the dying afternoon seemed richer, the air clearer, as if a lens had been cleaned. The heavy, oppressive grief had been transfigured into a sharp, purposeful clarity. I descended the stairs from the attic no longer as a ghost, but as a detective on the cusp of solving a 20-year-old mystery. The lacquered box was tucked securely under my arm, a reliquary containing both my past and my future. The slip of paper was still in the box, tucked neatly beside the letter. Arthur Finch, Finch & Associates, 42 Willow Street. The address was in the old part of the city, a neighborhood of brick townhouses and established, quiet professions, a world away from the steel and glass towers of my father's domain. I didn't call. I simply went, driving through the streets with a sense of surreal detachment, the letter sitting on the passenger seat like a silent companion. Willow Street was a cobblestone lane, shaded by ancient oak trees whose branches formed a canopy overhead. Number 42 was a narrow, three-story brick building with a dark green door and a polished brass knocker. The plaque beside the door was small, discreet. Finch and Associates, Estates and Trusts. This was not a place for corporate takeovers. It was a place for safeguarding legacies. I pushed the door open, a small bell chiming softly above me. The interior was hushed, smelling of old books, beeswax, and faintly of pipe tobacco. A young woman with kind eyes looked up from a desk. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Mr. Arthur Finch," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "My name is Elise Thorne. My mother was Eleanor Thorne." The woman's expression shifted from polite inquiry to one of recognition and a touch of solemnity. "Of course. One moment, please." She disappeared through a heavy oak door. A few minutes later, the door opened fully, and an old man stood there. He was tall and stooped, like a tree that had weathered many storms, dressed in a tweed jacket that was slightly frayed at the elbows. His hair was a shock of white, and his eyes, behind a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles, were a pale, intelligent blue. They held a deep, inherent sadness, but also a flicker of warmth. "Miss Thorne," he said, his voice a soft, gravelly baritone. He didn't sound surprised. He sounded as if he had been waiting for this day for a very, very long time. "Please come in." His office was a reflection of the man himself, orderly, comfortable, and steeped in history. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves groaned under the weight of legal volumes. A large, mahogany desk, its surface worn smooth by time and use, stood before a leaded glass window that looked out onto a small, manicured courtyard. He gestured for me to sit in a worn leather armchair before taking his own seat behind the desk, his movements slow and deliberate. "I knew you would come," he began, folding his hands on the desk, "though I had hoped the circumstances might be different. Your mother was a remarkable woman, a woman of great foresight and greater courage." I could only nod, my throat tight. I placed the lacquered box on the desk between us. "I found this today." He looked at the box, and a profound sadness deepened the lines on his face. "The forget-me-nots," he murmured. "She loved that box." He looked back at me. "You have her letter, then?" "I do." "Then you know," he said softly. It wasn't a question. "You know about Julian." Hearing the name spoken aloud by someone else, someone who had known him, made it real in a new and staggering way. The letter said, you had something for me. A trust. "I do." He turned slowly in his chair and opened a large, old-fashioned safe that was built into the bookshelves. From it, he withdrew a single, thick file tied with a faded red ribbon. He placed it on the desk with a soft thud, a sound that seemed to contain the weight of decades. He untied the ribbon with careful, almost ceremonial slowness. "Your mother came to me shortly after Julian's death," he explained, his voice taking on the measured tone of a man recounting a well-known story. "She was pregnant with you, and she was terrified, not for herself, but for you. She knew Robert's nature. She knew he would try to shape you, to dominate your spirit. And she knew that the one thing that could give you your own identity, your own freedom, was the legacy of your true father." He opened the file. On top was a legal document, its paper crisp and official. She placed Julian Vance's entire artistic estate into a blind trust. The physical paintings are in a climate-controlled storage facility. But more importantly, he tapped the document, transfers to you upon your 25th birthday or upon the reading of your mother's will, whichever came later, the sole and irrevocable copyright to every piece of artwork Julian Vance ever created. Every painting, every sketch, every study. The intellectual property, the soul of his work. He slid the document towards me. I looked down at the dense legalese, my eyes skimming until they found my name. Elise Marie Thorne, sole beneficiary. It was real. It was legal. It was mine. But what is it? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. What was it worth to him? Arthur Finch gave a small, sad smile. To Robert? Nothing. It was paint on canvas. A frivolity. It held no value on a balance sheet. That is why your mother was able to hide it in plain sight. He never thought to look for it, because he could not conceive of its worth. He reached into the file and pulled out a large, laminated photograph. But this, he said, his voice dropping to a reverent hush, this will show you. He slid the photograph across the desk. It was a painting, a cityscape, but unlike any I had ever seen. It wasn't a literal reproduction. It was the city's emotion. The buildings were not gray stone and steel, but swirls of deep indigo and vibrant gold, as if seen through a prism of rain and twilight. The lights in the windows were not mere points of illumination, but tiny, blazing stars. There was a feeling of immense loneliness in the composition, but also a breathtaking, defiant beauty. It was the way I had always felt the city, but had never been able to fully capture on my own canvas. My eyes, blurred with tears, dropped to the bottom right corner of the photograph. There, in a confident, flowing script, was the artist's signature. Julian Vance. My father's signature. A sound escaped me, something between a gasp and a sob. I knew that name, not from family stories, but from art magazines, from gallery reviews, from the hushed, respectful tones used when discussing certain modern masters. Julian Vance wasn't just an artist. He was a name celebrated in art circles. His early, groundbreaking work was studied. His paintings from his brief, brilliant period now hung in museums and in the private collections of billionaires who understood that some forms of value transcended numbers. The man whose legacy I now held was not an obscure, struggling painter. He was a visionary, and the signature on the canvas, his signature, was the final, irrefutable proof of my identity. It was the antithesis of the word worthless. It was a mark of undeniable, celebrated worth. I looked from the photograph to Mr. Finch, the question hanging unspoken in the air between us. He nodded slowly, his wise old eyes understanding everything. The current valuation of the estate, based on recent auction sales and appraisals of comparable works, is substantial, Miss Thorne. It far exceeds the individual bequests your brothers received. The number didn't matter. Not really. The value wasn't in the appraisal. The value was in the signature. It was in the knowledge that the very essence my father had despised was, in the real world, a thing of immense beauty and worth. I was not the daughter of a man who built fortresses of money. I was the daughter of a man who painted with light. And in that moment, holding the proof of it in my hands, I understood what my real inheritance truly was. It was not a fortune. It was a name. It was a truth. It was me. The walk back to my car from Arthur Finch's office was a journey through a world remade. The worn cobblestones of Willow Street, the dappled sunlight filtering through the oak leaves, the very air I breathed. It all felt charged with a new, profound significance. I held the thick file folder close to my chest, a shield against a past that could no longer harm me. Inside was not just paper and legal jargon. It was a new genesis, a revised history of my own existence. I didn't drive home immediately. I found a small, quiet park overlooking the river and sat on a bench, the file resting on my lap like a living thing. The city skyline, that familiar jagged silhouette of power and ambition, stood across the water. Somewhere in that forest of steel and glass were my brothers, likely in their new offices, already beginning the work of managing their multi-million-dollar kingdoms. For the first time, the thought elicited no pang of envy, no sting of inadequacy. It elicited something closer to pity. I opened the file again, not to the legal documents of transfer, but to the appendices Mr. Finch had included. There were pages of asset valuations, insurance appraisals, and lists of current holdings. The numbers were abstract, sequences of digits that my mind, still reeling, could barely process. But the context was everything. My father's $36 million empire, the fortune he had so meticulously divided between his true heirs, was impressive. It was the culmination of a lifetime of aggressive deals, calculated risks, and the relentless pursuit of expansion. It was a monument to a certain kind of power, the kind that shouts its presence from the top of skyscrapers. It was built brick by financial brick on a single, foundational act of betrayal. The very seed money, the capital that had launched Thorn Dynamics, was the fruit of his theft from Julian. His entire legacy was a gilded monument built on rotten ground. And then there was my inheritance. The valuation of Julian Vance's collection was staggering. The initial figure Mr. Finch had mentioned was not a ceiling, it was a floor. The file contained recent auction records for works from his era, for artists of his burgeoning reputation. A single major canvas from his Nocturne series had sold 2 years prior for an amount that, by itself, would have constituted a life-altering fortune. And I didn't own one painting. I owned all of them. I owned every sketch, every study, every last scrap of paper he had ever drawn on. More importantly, I owned the copyright. Every reproduction in a book, every licensed image, every future exhibition fee, it all flowed back to me. The math was cold and irrefutable. My share, the one deemed worthy of a single dollar, was, in purely financial terms, worth far more than the $36 million my brothers had just received. The irony was so perfect, it was almost poetic. The daughter he had cast out as a financial nullity was, in fact, the richest of them all. But as I sat there, watching the sunlight dance on the river, I knew with absolute certainty that the number was not the point. It was a convenient, worldly counterargument to his claim of worthlessness, a piece of evidence that would hold weight in the court of his own understanding. Yet, to fixate on it would be to miss the entire, breathtaking truth. The point was the origin. The man who had called me worthless had built his fortune on the ruin of the man whose blood I shared. The source of my father's disdain, my artistic temperament, my quiet soul, my perceived lack of ambition, was the direct lineage from the man he had envied, betrayed, and tried to erase. The very qualities he sought to extinguish in me were the immortal, celebrated essence of Julian Vance. My true wealth was not financial. It was spiritual and genetic. It was the validation that my way of seeing the world was not a flaw, but a birthright. The compulsion I felt to pick up a brush, to lose myself in the alchemy of color and form, was not a sign of a distracted mind, but the whisper of my true father's spirit. The fortune I now possessed was merely the tangible, market-approved echo of that deeper, more profound inheritance. I thought of Robert, sitting in his leather chair, dictating the terms of his will. He believed he was making a final, definitive statement on my value. He was drawing up the ultimate balance sheet of his life, and on it, I was a liability, a write-off. He never could have conceived that my mother, from beyond the grave, held a different ledger on her balance sheet, the one that measured the currency of love, truth, and legacy. I was the sole beneficiary of an incalculable treasure. He tried to define me by his own empty metrics. But my worth was never his to assign. It had been waiting for me all along, signed in the corner of canvas, hidden in a box of forget-me-nots, breathed into a letter scented with jasmine. I closed the file. The financial balance sheet was clear. I had one. But the personal balance sheet was what truly set me free. The scales had not been tipped by money, but by truth. The weight of his judgment was gone, replaced by the feather-light, unassailable weight of my own identity. I was not the worthless daughter of Robert Thorne. I was Elise, the daughter of Julian and Eleanor. And in that knowledge, I possessed a wealth that no one could ever quantify and no one could ever take away. The world expected a reckoning. It was a narrative as old as time itself. The disinherited child returns, empowered by a hidden fortune, to confront her oppressors and claim her rightful place in the spotlight. My brothers, I am sure, braced for it. Michael likely had his lawyers on speed dial, preparing for a legal challenge to the will or a public smear campaign. David probably anticipated a tearful, dramatic scene, full of accusations and demands for apology. The ghost of my father, I imagine, would have expected a campaign of vengeance, a desperate attempt to tarnish the empire he had built. I gave him nothing. There was no confrontation, no dramatic reveal, no carefully worded letter detailing my newfound wealth and their father's foundational sin. To have done so would have been to remain on the battlefield he had chosen, to fight a war using the currency of his world, power, leverage, the brutal calculus of victory and defeat. It would have meant that his final, venomous judgment still held enough power over me to dictate my actions. And it did not. I simply walked away. The process was quiet, methodical, and utterly liberating. With Arthur Finch's steady guidance, I assumed control of the Julian Vance estate. The transition was seamless, a private affair handled through discreet correspondence and the silent, efficient machinery of the trust. I visited the climate-controlled storage facility, a vast, silent space that held the physical heart of my inheritance. I spent a full day there, alone, walking through the racks that held my father's life's work. It was not like viewing art in a museum. It was a communion. Here was a series of sketches, quick and energetic, of my mother laughing. Here was a painting of a city street after rain, the pavement shimmering with 1,000 captured colors, a vision of alchemy that turned the mundane into the magical. I saw my own sensibilities reflected back at me, not as a faint echo, but as a clear, masterful voice. I was not an anomaly. I was a continuation. The financial reality of the estate was something I considered not as a personal treasury, but as a responsibility. The money, the staggering value of those canvases, had never been the point. It was a tool, and I knew precisely what to build with it. I established the Julian and Eleanor Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting young artists, painters, sculptors, writers, musicians, whose gentle souls and unique visions might otherwise be crushed by a world that often values conquest over creation. We provided grants, studio space, mentorship. We became a sanctuary for the worthless dreamers, a place where their currency of beauty was the only one that mattered. It was the perfect, living rebuttal to Robert Thorne's philosophy, not spoken in anger, but built with love. My own life transformed, not in its outward appearance, but in its fundamental core. I returned to my studio, and, this time, when I stood before the canvas, my hand was steady, the fear was gone. The critical, internalized voice that had always sounded like my father was silent. I painted with a freedom I had never known, my work bolder, more confident. It was no longer a desperate plea for validation. It was a conversation with my true father, a celebration of a shared legacy. I live a life fueled by creation, not conquest. My days were filled with the quiet, profound satisfaction of work that felt like purpose, of a foundation that felt like a family, of a peace that felt unshakable. The word worthless now had no power over me. It was not a scar I carried. It was a ghost I had laid to rest. It had not been erased by the monetary value of the paintings, though the irony was a sharp and satisfying punctuation to the story. It had been erased by a mother's fierce, foresight love, a love that had planned for my salvation 2 decades in advance. It had been erased by a father's legacy, a legacy not of wealth, but of vision left for me in the silent, powerful language of art. My brothers and I exist in a state of distant, polite truce. They run their empire. I tend to my foundation. Our interactions are cordial, shadowed by the unspoken truth that hangs between us. They know, in the vague way the art world whispers, that I am the sole heir to the increasingly valuable Julian Vance estate. They see the foundation that bears my parents' names. They understand, on some level, that the balance of power has shifted in a way they cannot comprehend. I do not enlighten them. The truth is not a weapon I choose to wield. It is a solace I choose to cherish. My real inheritance was never the value of the paintings. It was the validation. The validation that my gentle soul was not a flaw, but a gift. That my way of seeing the world was not a deficit, but a different and perhaps deeper form of intelligence. That my capacity for quiet contemplation was not a weakness, but a strength. This validation was left for me by 2 people who loved me long before the man in the cold office ever cast his final, hollow judgment. He had tried to define my worth by what I lacked, his ambition, his ruthlessness, his hunger for dominion. But my worth was defined by what I possessed: a mother's courage, a father's vision, and the unshakable knowledge that I was and always had been loved on my own terms. That is an inheritance that accrues no interest, suffers no market crashes, and can never be taken away. It is the only fortune that truly matters.